I'm Ivy Cohn, and with me today are Guy McPherson and Mike Sliwa. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ivy.
Well,
Nice to hear.
Guy, you're well known for your monster climate update essay, and amongst many other things. And Mike, you have a long string of brilliant essays on the Good Men Project. So there's just a tiny bit of context for the two of you. But what I'd like to talk to you about today is just how in the world did Nature Bat's last radio program get started? So why don't you give us the history on how that came to be?
Well, Guy and I, when I
Here's our
lived on Guy's property, and we used to go for walks with our wives, and we still do once in a while, although I live a little further down the road. And one day he was talking about potentially getting a radio show or an offer from the general manager at Progressive Radio Network. And he said he really had no interest in doing it. And I thought, well, I think it's a good opportunity to talk more about what we talk about. And so I asked him if he'd be interested in doing it if I helped co-host. And then he thought about that, and I think it kind of rolled from there. That's my memory of it, at least.
Yeah, let's go back one step and then go back a few steps before that. I was in New York, scheduled to be interviewed by Gary Knoll for, I think, 3 different topics. This was in mid-April of 2013, and I showed up in the studio on April 14th, 2013. And I met the producer for Gary's network, the Progressive Radio Network, and among the first words out of his mouth were, "You heard about Michael Rupert." This was the day after Michael Rupert died. And I said, "Yes, of course." And he said, "Would you like to take over his show, the Lifeboat Hour?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to have to think about that for a while." My initial response is no, but give me some time to think about it. And within 24 hours, Carolyn Baker had taken over the show. And then when I got back from that speaking tour, as Mike indicated, we were walking up the road, and that's where the conversation began. But really, our conversation began way back on April 6th, 2008. If you want to really dig into the dirty laundry, that's where we should start.
Well, what kind of dirty laundry are we talking about here, guys?
On April 6, 2008, I had my most dire prognosis published in the Arizona Republic, which is the largest, among the most conservative newspapers really in the western United States, and certainly for the Phoenix metropolitan area. And I'll let Mike tell what happened from there.
Yeah, it was an op-ed piece, I believe, and my father had a habit of showing me things that were, I don't know, controversial or in some cases ridiculous, just to kind of see, because he always gets a rise out of what people generally write in the Arizona Republic, specifically in the editorial page. And so he handed me the newspaper, and it was Guy's article, which, Guy, do you remember the exact title? I think it was something like "The End of the World as We Know It."
Yes, that's exactly the title, "The End of the World as We Know It."
Something lightweight.
Something you generally don't see in the Arizona Republic, or any newspaper for that matter, but specifically the Republic. And so I read the article, and I was teaching high school at the time, and my colleagues who I ate lunch with every day were pretty progressive group of guys, and another guy had read the article as well, and so we discussed it and decided we were going to call Guy up and ask him some specifics. And I don't remember exactly what we asked him, but all I do remember is we were sitting in my friend's media room, ironically, and got very deadpan in his responses, and it wasn't really sensationalized like we thought it might be. And we left about a half an hour to 45 minutes later, stunned and not really knowing what to do with the news. And it was primarily an article about peak oil at that point. And that kind of got the ball rolling for me as thinking about doing and why I'm doing it. And long story short, my friends are still in education, and I live in a tent.
Yeah, well, there you go. Now, had you two known each other prior to that, or was that the moment when Guy kind of came on your radar, Mike?
That was the unfortunate moment when Guy came on my radar. So I blame my father.
Yeah, well, there you go. You go.
The lead for that article, it was an op-ed piece. It appeared on the front page of the opinion page for the Arizona Republic, actually above the fold. So it was quite noticeable in the placement. And
Yeah.
and the lead goes like this: peak oil spells the end of civilization, and if it's not already too late, perhaps it will prevent the extinction of our species. So that's pretty radical for any newspaper, especially April 6th, 2008. That's a long time ago, much less a conservative outlet like the Arizona Republic.
So, how did the two of you then actually, become friends?
Well,
Mistakes have been made.
yeah, mistakes have been made. Right. Guy eventually was in Phoenix, I think, visiting actually somebody that used to comment on his post. And so we set up a coffee date. That was our first official meeting. This is, I'm not sure exactly how far after the initial call, maybe 6 months.
Yeah,
And we,
maybe even less. I was doing a presentation in Goodyear, a town named after the tires, because the tire company moved its entire operation to just outside of Phoenix and what has become engulfed by the Phoenix metropolitan area. So I was doing a little presentation on peak oil there, then meeting with somebody, one of the early people to post at Nature Bacillus, a guy named Frank Mizek. And since I was in the area, I told Mike it would be an opportunity for us to get together and have a cup of coffee. So I think it was you and Lance at the time, wasn't it, Mike?
yeah, one of my colleagues, one of the guys on the phone call. There were three of us on the phone call, and Lance was the other one that showed up for coffee. And yeah, I mean, fitting that he was doing a peak oil presentation in Goodyear, tires made of petroleum, but whatever. And I don't remember much of that meeting. I think it was more just rehashing of, what happened in the first conversation. I do remember leaving and following him out in a Prius, which made me smile. Um, but
You got to find those humor moments wherever you can.
Yeah.
right. And it really just got the ball rolling for me and my wife looking at a way we wanted to travel more and really kind of, we knew we weren't lifers as being educators. We were both teachers. And we kind of came across the idea of woofing and brought it up to Guy. And he thought, well, why don't you work on my property for room and board if you're going to start working on organic farms? And it was a good fit. So we came out twice before we quit our jobs. And we spent a couple days both times doing various jobs, digging ditches, clearing out a foundation for a citrus house, subterranean citrus house, greenhouse, and things like that. So we got a taste of it. And it didn't scare my wife at all. It frightened me to death. But I thought, well, this is different than sitting in a windowless classroom. And so the rest is history.
Yes, as it were.
Yeah, so I moved here full time to the homestead in May of 2009. So it was about a year after that op-ed piece came out, and we remained in periodic contact during that year. And then Mike and Karen made their first visit here at their fall break, October 2010, and came and spent their spring break here, March 2011, and then moved here and began their second careers beyond the public education life on June 2nd, I think, 2011.
The day after my fourth birthday. So I was on the road, left my house on my birthday, and with the guy's property the next day, and we were there for 3 months.
And then woofed other places. Went to
Correct.
Europe for a while and here and there, and then spent about a year on a homestead about 30 miles from here. As I recall,
Right.
that was most of 2013, and then moved here for almost 2 years in the yurt, starting in January 2014.
Oh, you all have a nice long history together. I'm glad that you all got hooked up because one of the net results is that you're doing a weekly show. And Nature Bats Last on Progressive Radio Network has been happening now for what, Guy?
I,
Well,
Mike, wasn't it August 7th, 2014? Wasn't that our first broadcast?
Yeah, so I guess roughly almost a year and a half now.
okay. Well, you've covered a lot of different topics. Environmentalism, climate change, social criticism, a broad variety of topics over that period of time. But recently, and I don't know how this came to be, but you decided to take a sort of different approach with your show, at least occasionally. I think of it as Guy puts on his snark.
I'm just making it more public. It's been there the whole time, trust me.
Yes.
Oh, well, good, good. Come out of the closet with that snarkiness.
Yeah.
So, you want to talk a little bit about how that evolution occurred?
Well, when we started, just a little background, and then I'll let Mike talk about how we started doing the takedown shows. And most of these are Mike's ideas. He was in media long before I was. I was in the straitjacket of higher education for pretty much my entire life. When we started the show, it was all very scripted and rigid and pretty pathetic looking back. We didn't quite know what to say, so we had all these episodes. I don't even remember the names of all of them. It was, is this from the mainstream or is it from a source called The Onion? And it was difficult for us to just fill the space. And we were interviewing a bunch of people that were pursuing radical paths, getting to the root of matters on a variety of topics because we specifically did not want it to be the near-term human extinction hour because we'd run out of material for that in about an hour. And that doesn't make much of a weekly show. So, Mike, you might want to talk about some of the ideas you've had over the year and a half we've been on the air, and talk about the changes we've made and that sort of thing.
Sure. I mean, in the beginning, guys, we really didn't. I mean, I had done a little bit of radio in high school, and I interviewed for a radio job directly out of college, which I didn't get. So that'll tell you thing. So I just thought, well, how are we going to fill this space? I can't babble for 3 hours like Rush Limbaugh. So I tried to come up with different segments like Breaking Hopium and News Beyond the Mainstream Headlines, Doomer of the Week, and things like that. So we would have one, it would break the show up, and it wouldn't just be us bad because we were really good when we were by ourselves. But as soon as that little red light went on, it was kind of like this Cindy Brady moment where you just freeze and you're like, oh, we're on the air and people can hear us, and now we're really conscious of it. And the other thing was we really wanted to get other people involved in the show and not just make it about us. And that was difficult, although you guys at Extinction Radio have done a fabulous job at that. For us, it was hard to get consistency where we could rely on people to call in week to week to do their particular piece of the show. And I don't blame people, they have lives and maybe the show just didn't interest them that much. But when they did contribute, it was great. It was just we didn't know when they were going to. And in the beginning, we were having issues back and forth with the studio as well, on our end and their end with audio and such. So it was difficult in trying to schedule people when to call in. It's not like they were calling into us. They had to call into the studio, and the studio has over 50 shows. So to schedule time for those people to record their pieces was difficult.
Well, especially considering that the station is, we're in the midst of economic contraction. And so the studio doesn't have 27 engineers sitting around waiting for somebody to call in and 4 studios. So, they're constrained as well.
Yeah, they moved several times as well, and they let people go, so they were in flux as well. So it was it was a difficult first really year almost, I think.
But you persevered.
Yeah, we persevered, and eventually I got to the point where I didn't want to interview people every week because it's not always easy to get people to interview that we'd want to interview and have something to say that we think is radical enough and worthwhile. And there were plenty of people out there saying things who were getting a lot of attention that we thought nobody is really challenging them. And those are the climate scientists or the supposed climate scientists and representatives of what's going on in the climate world. And we just started going after those people we saw on mainstream programming who were getting a lot of airtime and credibility. And the Michael Manns of the world, for example. And I thought it was a good opportunity for us, and specifically Guy, to take his work and show the inconsistencies of their work in how they were not necessarily loyal to the data, but more loyal to the institution or organization or their celebrity status.
And even before that, we did a show on our own, and that was sort of groundbreaking because it was a call-in show. We didn't really have any script. We didn't have anybody we were going to interview for an extended period of time. It was just two of us, and I remember our wives being quite nervous about that because they didn't think we could fill an hour with chit-chat. As it turns out, we can fill 8 or 10 hours with chit-chat, but for about an hour, we can make it entertaining enough that people will tune in. And so that was sort of a groundbreaking moment for us as well. And then gradually, Mike especially came to recognize that people were not telling the whole story about climate change. And this included not just climate scientists, but pundits as well,
Right.
who wrote about the topic and claimed expertise.
And in observing this from my side, it feels like the whole dynamic needed to get to a certain point before you would be able to take this kind of an approach. As my friend Mary Nelson and I have often said, collapse has not proceeded far enough to be able to do that yet.
Right, and so we had to build a little credibility so that people would be willing to listen to us, for one thing. And my work on climate change has been going for quite a while, but it's still not exactly viewed by the mainstream as something they want to cover every week. So we had to build an audience and become comfortable with each other before we started railing on the work of other people. And so, yeah, it took a little while to get to this point.
Yeah, well, I would imagine that the two wives probably had some concerns about you taking this new approach.
Yes, and I think, well, I'm not sure what Karen's take is. She lives on the edge, and has the whole time I've known her. Um, as an unnamed United Nations soldier said, quoted in a book I read long ago, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space. And Karen doesn't take up too much space.
Now, Karen, for lack of a better way, doesn't give a shit. I mean, she does give a and not in the sense that she doesn't give a shit what's happening in the world, but she knows as the world burns, things need to be said, and if we can say them, great. And if it ruffles some feathers, that's okay with her.
She hit stage 7 long before I did.
Yeah.
Ah, very
Ditto.
good. Yeah. So yes, so you've taken this sort of call out type. You used another phrase there, Guy. Take down
Yeah,
approach.
probably
Call out.
call out is better. We're really just trying to point out the inconsistencies in the work of these people who claim climate science as their domain. And we're, we come across as fairly harsh, I'm sure, but we're really trying to stay professional about it. We send a message to each of the people we're going to focus on in advance, ask them to call into the show, and then send them a link to the podcast of that episode as well. So it's not as if we're sneaking up on them, and I've had enough of that happen in my life that I hear about people writing about me, speaking about me after the fact. So we wanted to be professional enough to not take that approach. And yet it comes across as kind of mean sometimes because these people are not telling the whole story based in the data, based in the science. They're going to a political realm instead of a scientific realm.
Hmm. Well, I appreciate very much the fact that you are, upfront and communicating. I think that's, a very good thing to do. Let them know what's up. I doubt if any of them have responded to you.
Not as yet.
No,
No. So, Mike, I understand that you are somewhat responsible for having found the clips, the various clips that you've used in some of the recent shows, dug around and collected them, curated them, lined them up. How was that for you? Just that bit of the research that you were doing.
Well, I've learned a great deal, and a lot of the credit goes to some of our listeners sending clips to me as well, and then me going through them or trying to go through them because they send a bunch of them and then trying to organize them in a way that makes sense to the broadcast and not repeating and so on and so forth. But for me, we've only really done, I believe, 2 shows that are call-out shows, and it's given me a chance to actually look at the science because, quite frankly, the science has never really interested me. I've always looked at this from a societal aspect and just observed, of what's going down. You know, I don't necessarily need all the data, although I'm aware of a great deal of it, to convince me of what's happening. My standard line is if you just sit in a mall for 15 minutes and watch people, we're screwed on some levels. And so but what's nice is I think it's given me some more material in my arsenal and to cement some more of the feelings I've had about what's happening and really pushed me to, I think the show really in some cases needs to have some more urgency to it because of what's happening. We have an opportunity to say things and point things out and start a conversation. And we can't necessarily waste that time because there's not that time.
Yeah, the urgency factor is definitely upon us.
Mhm.
And that that collapse hasn't proceeded far enough to do that
Right.
line. I think in many respects it has now, and therefore why would we not really be telling it like it is? Bringing a little bit of a spotlight onto some of these inconsistencies of people who have otherwise great credibility out there in the world, uh, to spark people to be a little bit more discerning, a little bit more questioning, um, dig a little deeper. Just don't take it at face value. I think this is a good bit that you two have brought in this new approach. I was absolutely astonished, actually, at some of the clips that you've played. I just sat there and scratched my head. It's like, they really said that in public?
Right. And they say it, and it's not just one person. It needs to be a talking point. And the main talking point is if things are bad, but if we start right now, we pull through. That is universal through at least the climate scientists world.
Well, that's a huge hit of denial right there, isn't it?
yes, it is. And not only, I mean, the second most ludicrous thing they all say is some form of adherence to the 2-degree political target.
Mhm.
And I can't imagine they don't know that the scientific target was long past. I mean, you don't have to look very deep to find out that the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases said 1 degree is the absolute upper limit we can't cross. That was in October of 1990, and that was the scientific approach. It was William Nordhaus, a neoclassical economist, who promoted the idea of 2 degrees C. And I'm not sure how any self-respecting scientist comes to believe what an economist says in terms of a target with respect to climate change. But there you are.
Yeah, that's fairly ludicrous.
Yeah, and I think it's important that shows like Extinction Radio, both our Resist Radio Derek Attention Show, and Nature Chats, those shows have individuals who are not loyal to an institution or an organization or really their career. And we can say things that other people cannot say, and that matters. That matters in a world where we just hear the same thing over and over again, and people are always thinking about the consequence.
So the consequences are are too big. They're prohibiting many individuals from actually, even though they may know in their own heart of hearts what is
Sure.
so.
Yeah, their own personal economy is more important. And I'm not blaming people necessarily. I understand, you have to support your family and you have to support yourself. But let's be honest about what's going on here, because you're putting the economy in front of what's actually supporting the economy personally and institutionally, and that's not acceptable.
So, do you see a time in the very near future where it will, in fact, get to the point where some of these individuals realize that their career, their status really is not worth a nickel and, break out of those change as, you and Guy have done, as so many have done, that gives them that freedom to really tell it like it is?
And for me, I have a hard time imagining that could happen. Another thing that these folks hang on to pretty tightly is civilization itself. I don't see a lot of them pointing out what the research says, dating back to 2007, that only collapse of civilization prevents runaway climate change. I see all of these folks promoting the idea that we can use civilization to overcome the ills created by civilization.
Right.
Obviously that doesn't make any sense, but I don't think anybody's going to say that because this is where an addiction to civilization takes one. And the inability to see to another way when this is the only way you've known and the only way you can imagine is problematic, to say the least.
Yeah, so you don't know there's another way, so you bring up civilization to folks, and I've done it a few times as well. They don't know what that means necessarily. There's a long pause. I remember, bringing up extinction in the possibility because of civilization to one of our guests, Mary Piefer, and there was about a 10-second pause because she was so locked in, like most people are, to capitalism, and capitalism being the end all. If we can just fix capitalism, and you bring up civilization, and that's like the water that you don't know what to do with that. That's how you live, and to give up your own piece of flesh, well, that's just not in the cards for most folks.
No, no, not something that people easily embrace.
No.
And yet that is precisely the liberating factor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It's
and
what it's what brought three of us together.
Yeah.
yes, and unfortunately, there aren't very many of us who are willing to walk away from that um, money-driven life. And civilization is driven by money. They arose essentially at the same time. So, if you don't have money, you're a lot more willing to take these steps than if you're completely dependent upon and adhere to the religion that is the monetary system.
I know. I've been thankful for years that I'm a pauper. It gives such freedom in that.
Yeah.
It can be a little dicey month to month, but there is genuine freedom. I, at this time, when we as a species maybe, and so of course the hundreds of thousands of species that have been driven to extinction already, but the human species has this self-reflective awareness and language. We have an opportunity to drop those tens of thousands of years of cultural programming and be in the universe in a way that civilization prohibits. So there's this little teeny moment here. It may not last very long, but we do have this opportunity to genuinely live in a fresh way.
And it isn't people in civilization would understand. They love that word, opportunity. And um, I think what I try and tell people is there's a whole bunch of us waiting just on the other side of that whole fear paradigm. And when you come over, like and I meet these folks, I'm like, wow. I'm thankful for one thing, and then I'm like, what took me so long?
Yeah. And I think there are many people who have that sense of, oh dear, I've wasted, most of my life with this. They
Yeah.
really want to make the most of whatever time they may have left. So,
Right.
in the time that we have left, what does the Nature Bats Last radio program have in store for us?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Mike, you've been making all the suggestions that got us to this point. What do we have in mind?
Well, this week we have who's our? I can't think of her name. It's
Sarah Perry.
yeah, every cradle has a grave. Is that how is
Now,
that the
hold
title?
on, hold on. Everybody broke up there for a second. So,
Okay.
let's get the person's name again, please.
Go ahead,
Okay,
guys.
it's Sarah Perry, and her book is Every Cradle is a Grave. It was published in 2014, and it's taking, again, a very radical approach to life itself and how we treat um, suicide in this culture is something that we just really shy away from, even having the conversation. And not only is she pro-suicide, but she's anti-natalist. So she says when you look at the suffering of individuals who come into the world, maybe it's not worth coming into the world. So she's sort of anti being born, and not just for humans. So
Yeah,
it,
it's a
and
fascinating book.
it's a great book, and it's heavily researched. She turns to the refereed journal literature. She's a housewife, and she's able to connect this information together and read the journal literature and come to these profound conclusions that really will challenge the way most people think.
Well, we'll be looking forward to that show. That sounds like a good one.
Yeah.
And then, these are the kinds of people we're looking for who challenge the way we think and ask questions that make us question the way we live. And there's just not nearly enough of that out there. And so when we come across somebody who's doing that, we latch right on. We'll continue with the climate scientist or climate pundit show focused on inconsistencies in other people's work. We'll do that about once a month. And so far, we've also been having strictly a call-in show where Mike and I just chat with our callers about what's going on in the world, approximately once a month. And so that leaves 2 or 3 times a month where we are seeking an interviewee. And we have, to be honest, we have difficulty finding those people because there aren't that many people doing something different in the world. Don't you think that's the case, Mike? That we just have a hard time finding people who are truly radical?
Yeah, and willing to come on. We think some folks are truly radical, and so we ask them on the show, and they're concerned about the topic generally, and we try and put them at ease that we're going to talk about their work, not necessarily Guy's work or near-term human extinction or abrupt climate change, but we want to take their work and possibly connect it to the things we talk about. And once we do that, most of the time they come around. Although we've been turned down a bunch of times where people just don't reply or thank you. Um, but I think for the most part, I'd say 7 of the people we um, contact eventually come on the show.
Well, I like particularly the shows where the two of you are chatting and it's open for call-ins and chatting with people out there, giving individuals a place where they can actually add their thoughts and contribute to the conversation. Because as you both know, many people who are on the page with us feel very lonely. They
Yes.
have no one in their world with whom they can connect. Um, we're coming to the close of our time here, but I'd like to just go back for a moment to the word radical, because apparently it has been pretty well co-opted at this point. And so using the whole phrase, getting to the root, rather than using the word radical, I just want to hear your thoughts on that, either of you, both of you.
Yeah, I'll go first. For a while, when I do a public presentation, especially if it was on a college campus to a classroom, the first thing I do is put that symbol up on the board, the one that we know as the square root symbol. And I would ask, what is this? And almost always the answer was, it's the square root symbol. And well, what if you put a 3 or a 4 right here? It's not really the square root symbol. It can take the cubic root or the quartic root or whatever, right? And besides which, you're telling me what it does, not what it's called. And so these are college students. Presumably all of them had a class at some point that told them the name of that thing, but almost nobody can think of it. If I go to a high school, occasionally somebody remembers that that is a radical, that the symbol itself is a radical, and it's called that because it gets to the root of. But you're right, the word has been co-opted. It's come to be consistent with extremism. So you're not a radical anymore, you're an extremist, and that word has been applied to people who take an extreme approach.
But yeah, nobody actually goes to the root. I ask people all the time, do you want to get to the root of what our societal ills are? And they say, sure. I go, well, then you're a radical. And they're like, huh? So that's really what it's about. I mean, and as far as I can tell, for the most part, the things we generally talk about, the root is civilization. And if somebody can point out something else, I'd be happy to listen.
Well, do either of you have any last thoughts, comments?
Well, I must say thank you to Mike especially, and obviously to all of our listeners out there. But Mike has really been the driving force behind the show and the positive changes we've made along the way to make the show better. The reason I really wanted to do the show in the first place, that he sort of talked me into doing it with him, is we didn't have overlapping lives, really, and certainly not on the professional front. So we'd spend a little time chatting about various things, but Aristotle's definition of friendship is people who work together on a project for the common good. It's not drinking buddies. So Mike and I would get together and we'd have meals together and that sort of thing on a regular basis, but we weren't working together on a project for the common good. We weren't friends in the Aristotelian sense. And so I wanted to, when he offered the idea, I saw this as a brilliant way to do just that. And so I think our friendship has deepened greatly as a result of that.
Absolutely. And there's no Nature Bats Last without the Nature Bats Last blog, and so there's no blog without Guy. So the show is Guy's namesake, and it's about Guy's work in supporting his particular message and how we can connect other messages, including my own, to that particular message to show that what we all talk about is universal. It doesn't matter if you're talking about gun control or peak oil or population. It all comes down to civilization in the end, and what's supporting our lives and the cost of that.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so very much for sharing the history and the future, whatever little tiny bit of future we may have left.
Thank you for the opportunity, Ivy. It's a pleasure to chat with you as always.
A lot of fun. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen. Until next time.